So Dr. Palmer, we have attendees from, oh goodness, Australia, Finland, Austria, Malta. Let me look through the list here. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that.
Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, yes. Finland, I mentioned Finland. And more people are joining, so.
Well, we were told, Maria tells us it's 1 in the morning over in Australia, and
In winter.
yeah, in winter.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for joining us. All right.
Okay, I'm going to,
Thank you for being here.
no, we are now recording. So Dr. Milliken, would you please introduce our keynote?
I am happy to do so.
And if everyone will please mute your microphones. Of course, Dr. Palmer.
Except for her, yes. Well, I will, while that's going on, let me do a brief introduction for Dr. Palmer. She's noted as a visionary pragmatist in artificial intelligence. Dr. Palmer is the founder and chief AI strategist.
Progress.
Shall I start again? Okay. Do you hear a reverberation by chance? No, it stopped. Okay. All right. Well, I am honored to be able to introduce Dr. Lisa Palmer as our keynote on day one. She is noted as a visionary pragmatist in artificial intelligence, and Dr. Palmer is the founder and chief AI strategist for AI Leaders, which is a boutique advisory and consulting firm. Her unique background as a seasoned IT practitioner, enterprise software leader, and researcher gives her the edge needed to transform product leaders or businesses, et cetera. And she inspires Fortune 500 executives, board directors, and product leaders to boldly question everything, and to help tackle that unforeseen risks and untapped opportunities brought by generative AI. Lisa was previously the vice president and America's regional manager for Gartner Executive Programs, leading advisory services for over 900 commercial and state and local government C-suite executive accounts. She also previously held go-to-market leadership roles at Microsoft and combined CIO, CMO, and role in financial services. I've known Dr. Palmer since she was in graduate school the first time. So Dr. Palmer is determined to ensure that AI both well serves humanity and drives international business competitiveness. A respected speaker both nationally and internationally for a diverse audience ranging from tech companies and universities to government organizations and industry groups. Lisa's AI expertise is frequently sought, and she's been featured in media venues, including Fox News, NBC News, New York Post, The Sun, Global Finance, CIO Magazine, Newsy, iHeartRadio, and others. Lisa holds a bachelor's in technology engineering. She has an MBA, and she recently completed her PhD defending her AI doctoral dissertation focused on the business impacts of artificial intelligence. She's also an active proponent for women in technology. So we are able to share 5 fun facts about Lisa, which add some color to her impressive portfolio. And one is that she grew up on a farm, and the first vehicle that she ever drove was a combine. We don't know if that was corn, wheat, Milo. She might tell us. Number 2, she made the college varsity softball team by hitting a run, scoring a triple during opening tryouts. Number 3 was she rode a roller coaster to disembark from the Great Wall of China. Number 4, she caught a spoonbill fish, and those are well known here in Oklahoma. They're prehistoric fish, and it was nearly as long as she is tall. They have very long spoonbills. And finally, she treasures time with her kids, both her human kids and her fur kids. So with that introduction, I'd like to throw this over to Dr. Palmer. Welcome. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Milliken. That introduction makes me sound quite eclectic. Thank you so much. All right. Well, we are going to jump into my dissertation. Is hot off the presses. It quite literally was just approved for publication earlier in July. So we are doing this right on the tail end, and I'm going to take you through a journey. I'm going to explain it very much in research terms, but I want to tell you the story of why I pursued this. So my topic was about business value in enterprise situations. So let's dig into, I want to talk about what the study was, the problem I wanted to address, the purpose of it, and really get into the details from a research perspective. So the problem I wanted to address. So imagine this, I am a woman in the technology arena, which in my line of work, as you get older, can be a really challenging situation to be in. And so as I was facing my 50s, and this was right before COVID happened, I was looking at the macro environment and asking myself, what do I want to do in my next act, in the next part of my career? Because I really need to reinvent myself and reinvigorate myself to make sure that I get to continue to enjoy the career in technology that I've had for so many years. And so what I asked myself was, looking at the state of the technology world and what is most likely to happen, where could I focus and what could I do next? And that led me to conclude that artificial intelligence was going to be the next thing that impacted the world in the most significant way. I just really believe this in my heart after having been in and around technology for so many years. So the challenge that we face from an artificial intelligence perspective is that it's largely ungoverned or wildly differently governed in different parts of the world, and even arguably state to state in the United States, it looked very different. So I wanted to dig in pragmatically to what is happening with artificial intelligence in enterprises where they are choosing to self-govern. And so I also wanted to use, because we were in the midst of COVID by the time that I decided to do this and was looking into this, really, what exactly did I want to dig into? I thought I wanted to use a modern data source for my research. And at that time, the amount of podcasts were just exploding. There were podcasts everywhere, and every person that I had wanted to listen to and learn from that were significant in the field of artificial intelligence, they were all talking on podcasts. And I thought, how fantastic would it be if I actually had access to these individuals that I don't know and probably wouldn't have time to get to in the purview of my study. I wanted to access these individuals that were doing really cutting edge things with artificial intelligence. And I saw a modern vehicle to do that through podcasts. So I decided to do a qualitative study using podcast data. And I was going to focus on these enterprise leaders that were really at the leading edge. And so my research questions were this: what are for-profit enterprise leaders' motivations in AI governance decision-making? I wanted to know why they chose to use AI and what decisions they made along the way. What actions are they taking? What did they do during the process of choosing to move forward with artificial intelligence? And then what were the organizational outcomes that they were creating as a result of investing in artificial intelligence? And then finally, my theoretical question: in what ways do for-profit enterprise leaders implement AI governance processes that align with my framework of my study, which was the Model AI Governance Framework? And that framework was actually created by the Singaporean government, who for many years has been touted as one of the most innovative countries in the world. And this theoretical framework is very practitioner oriented and focused on helping those that actually implement technology in the market to be pragmatic and structured in the way that they go about this. And so that framework has 2 guiding principles and it has 4 practices that support it. So the research approach that I wanted to use and the model framework that I wanted to pursue, it was important to me that this revolved around behaving in a responsible way. So my research approach was based on constructivism. I wanted to focus on the lived experiences of the individuals along this path. And as Dr. Milliken indicated when she introduced me, I have a varied past and I have multiple lenses that I see the world through. So I wanted to be able to bring that perspective to the table as well. And being able to be engaged in qualitative research, I felt like would give me more opportunity to take advantage of that diversity of perspective. I wanted to make sure that I had diverse perspective at the table in all of those individuals that I chose to be involved in the study. And that included not only those that were podcast hosts and podcast guests, but also research reviewers. And I'll explain that a little bit. So in the field of artificial intelligence, the diversity of perspectives is so critical. Having different viewpoints, backgrounds, cultures, a different type of diversity that we can engage when we are building artificial intelligence helps us to create less biased outcomes. But it helps us to create outcomes that better serve humanity, which is really near and dear to my heart. So this idea of diversity of perspectives was incredibly important to me in the design of my study. I wanted to focus on things that were action-oriented. I wanted to make sure that we were going to be able to take the output of what I learned and apply it in a practical sense inside of businesses, as well as I wanted to be able to inform policymakers with what I learned. That's what led me to choose the Model AI framework, because it's very pragmatic, it's very innovative, and these things are perfectly fit for the space of artificial intelligence. And then I wanted to make sure that I was looking at enterprise business environments, because I believe that enterprise business environments have the opportunity to create a much broader and deeper impact than many other organizations have the opportunity to do. Some of the largest organizations in the world are able to influence policymaking. They're able to influence hundreds of thousands of their employees and their families and the ripple effects that go with that. So that's why it was so important to me to focus on those kinds of enterprise business environments. So from a research procedure perspective, I wanted to take the qualitative approach so that I could get these rich descriptions of what actually happened and be able to address my research questions in a way that delved into those human experiences. I was going to learn to use these podcasts, which was new. And my university, Southern Nazarene University, challenged me in saying that we haven't had anyone use podcasts as a data source before. If you can find one example anywhere in the world where podcasts have been used as a data source, then we will support this. And I had the fantastic assistance of a librarian from SNU, because on my own, I spent hours and hours and couldn't find a single one that had used podcasts as a data source. And through her fantastic help, I ultimately found one, and it was a fantastic example, and I was able to get that approved and be able to move forward with using podcasts. And I had to go through a multifaceted selection process where I had to select the podcast hosts, the podcast participants, those interviewees, as well as did someone have a question? Okay, so that was a multifaceted selection process. And then in the coding, I wanted to make sure that I listened, and I listened very carefully. And because I wanted to use research reviewers to also enrich the information that I had available, I had this idea that in addition to myself listening and coding this information, I also wanted to get those additional external perspectives. So I created thematic episode synopses. And then I took those synopses and I turned them into a SurveyMonkey survey. And I used episode reviewers who all had extensive experience in the technology arena and were comfortable with artificial intelligence terminology. And I shared that survey with them and asked them to either validate or alter the themes that I had seen emerge in the data. And then I also asked them just to give me free form comments about what came to mind for them. So I ultimately created two separate data sets. I had the data from the original podcast interviews and the data set from the research reviewers. In the significance of my study, I really wanted to focus on these action-oriented insights for AI governance. The AI, despite what you hear in the media, has been around for decades, over 7 decades, and arguably the math, of course, goes back far, far beyond that. So it's been very slow to be adopted. And in general, for technology to be adopted, there are 3 criteria that have to be in place. The market has to be conducive through regulatory and legal means. The technology itself has to be capable, and society has to be willing to accept it. And so what we've seen with artificial intelligence over this really long period of time that it has been available in various forms is that we've never had all 3 of those at the same time. So there have been challenges along the way that have caused AI to go in and out of what are referred to as AI winters, where it becomes, often from a societal perspective, it becomes less interesting or more concerning, and people back away from using it or aren't interested in continuing to invest. So we've seen that kind of ebb and flow with AI through the years. So the contribution of my study was intended to provide action-oriented insights to help organizations to be able to push past any concerns that might come up. And then I also wanted, through my theoretical research question, to dig into this very young model AI governance framework. It was only 2 years old at the point where I opted to use it as the foundation for my study. So I wanted to understand the impacts of that particular foundational model and how that really could inform and assist enterprises if they were to marry their efforts with something like this. So I wanted to see how they lined up with my governance framework and address this gap. There was a lack of actionable research available in the field of AI, a lack of practitioner-focused research. And so I sought to fill that gap. There were practical implications. I wanted practitioners to be able to take this information and really apply it in their environments. I wanted to provide them with some yes, do this, and no, don't do that kinds of insights. And then from a self-governance perspective, I wanted to learn those organizations who were stepping forward and choosing to self-govern. What did that look like? And let them really be beacons for others to learn from through my research. So when I went through the literature review, 3 really big items popped out to me. There was this need for AI governance. AI governance was wildly, and continues to be today, wildly different in different parts of the world. There was also this idea of the successful implementation of AI. Many organizations had tried to pursue artificial intelligence and hadn't been successful for one reason or another. And this was an important area to understand. And then the third piece was that we wanted to see this conflict around AI's advanced capabilities for automated decision-making. And I saw this great conflict between this automated decision capability of artificial intelligence and the ability to ensure that that automated decision-making is well-serving humanity. So in all of the research in my literature review process, it was very clear that those were often at odds with one another when it came to innovation. So looking to understand that conflict was very important. So let's talk about the methodology that I undertook. So the epistemological perspective and a qualitative approach is what I chose to pursue. So this constructivist philosophical view, how individuals construct their meaning based on their unique experiences, the value of this cross-sectional perspective was so important to leverage and to learn from. And this multifaceted experience really contributed to informing my research questions and the analysis. I used a qualitative approach because it allowed me to deal with descriptive data and observe phenomenon. And it was so important to data mine the experiences of these individuals who have already been successful. And then from a qualitative design perspective, I went with a historical analysis using published podcasts. So the idea here was to gather quotes from these very seasoned podcast hosts and to gather quotes from these very seasoned AI individuals, these people that were really bringing it to life in these enterprise environments. And then finally, to also gather quotes from my research reviewers. So from a context perspective, the published podcast interviews really substituted for traditional site locations. This allowed me to push past any geographic locations that would have limited who I had access to interviewing. And having the varied industries, I chose individuals from various industries that were everything from technology laggards to technology visionaries. It was important to have that span of experience with regard to those individuals that had been successful with AI. So I ultimately selected 4 distinct podcasts that were part of my overall study. The selection criteria were that they had to be focused on AI application in business. That was very specific. The episodes had to range from 20 to 60 minutes in length, and the podcast hosts themselves had to be AI knowledgeable and seasoned hosts. So I had hosts that ranged in having interviewed 60 to 660 different participants over their career as podcast hosts. And each one of the podcasts had to describe its mission, target audience, and the host's background so that I had clarity of their true perspective. From a data collection and analysis perspective, the qualitative research methods that I used were to capture these insights through listening. Making sure that the sample selection process involved a myriad of different episodes and different participants, those interviewees. I wanted to make sure that I had a really broad selection of different companies, different industries, individuals that had different backgrounds and experiences. And then from a data analysis perspective, I did do a two-part data analysis. I had to analyze the podcast quotes. And then after I received the secondary research data set from my research reviewers, I had to analyze those as well. I analyzed the podcast quotes through keyword identification, through word cloud analysis, and then through this creation of individual episode synopses. The research episode reviewers either validated or offered alternatives to the sub-themes that I created in those syntheses. And then I combined that podcast interviewee, host, and reviewer data to map the sub-themes into themes and to really look at how did it or did not align with my model AI governance framework. So as a qualitative researcher, I realized that I brought unique perspective to this. I do have extensive experience myself in the field of big data and data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning. I also have been in marketing and sales. I have a varied experience, so I knew that that cross-sectional viewpoint would serve this study well. I wanted to be careful, however, to avoid bias in my study, as we all want to from a research perspective. Mine was amplified in this area because artificial intelligence is so prone to bias. So I really wanted to be cautious here. I wanted to make sure that I had neutral interviewers and external podcast or episode reviewers, people that I didn't know, that didn't know me. I wanted to make sure that I was hands off from that. And since the design of my study allowed me to use
Ei, kun se puhdistusaine.
so
Kyllä se oli niinku haaveksen puhdistusaine, että toi oli aivan kuin bakteeri, se oli isommiksi. Eli se tuli niinku...
If you would mute, please, that would be really helpful. Okay, I'll go ahead and proceed forward.
Taru, can you mute, please?
Thank you. Okay, so I want to make sure I avoided bias, and because of the design of my study, I wasn't interacting directly with the interviewees, so that did help to create some level of protection against that type of bias. But I did realize that there could be a bias embedded in my selection process, in those interviewees that I chose, in the podcast that I chose, et cetera. So I was just trying to be super aware of the bias that could be included. And then from an ethical considerations perspective, respect for persons, beneficence, and really important. I wanted to make sure that we had full disclosure and voluntary participation from the research reviewers, because they actually were participants in the study, where those that were podcast interviewees and podcast hosts, their data was publicly available, and therefore they didn't meet the IRB standards for needing to pursue their actual voluntary participation. Okay, so from a data collection perspective, I used publicly available podcasts. I downloaded those podcasts. I used analysis in the analysis process. I used triangulation for credibility and reliability. From a thematic analysis, it's the approach I took to identify patterns and themes. And I really want to make sure everything was grounded in evidence. The research episode reviewers provided, they had to have diverse backgrounds and expertise. They provided additional dependability and credibility. It wasn't just my perspective as I looked at this data, but I was also gathering perspective from others as well. Active engagement with the podcast content, actively listening to that content, in many cases over and over again, to make sure that I really heard what they were saying, and then enriching the interpretation of those themes. So like with every study, I fully recognize that my study had limitations. From a qualitative study perspective, we know that every human brings their own biases to the table, so we have to take that into consideration. The design actually of my study did create limitations because I wasn't able to speak directly to these fantastic hosts and interviewees and research reviewers. I wasn't, from a depth and scope perspective, I wasn't able to really dig in and get to more precise questions and ask those layered questions that you would be able to in a one-on-one interview. I had a very limited timeline to get this done in, as we all do from a research perspective. And then there are only a limited number of artificial intelligence successful applications available in the market. So the scenarios within the AI field aren't as broad as you might like for them to be. And then considerations for applicability, because these are specific situations with specific lived experiences, that there will be parallels to some people and not for others. So with regard to the overall data makeup, my data consisted of those direct quotes from podcast hosts, from podcast interviewees, and then I had written quotes that came in from my research reviewers. So these were, and then of course I had my own insights that I gleaned from listening to this data. So it was important through this process that I think about the different lens of those who were being interviewed. And I captured them in 3 different categories. They were either artificial intelligence practitioners. So these were the people that work inside of companies and were bringing AI to life for their companies. Then there were vendor practitioners. So these were people that mostly sell artificial intelligence software and services. And then the third category was consultants who were actively working in most situations with the practitioners to bring these artificial intelligence solutions to life. So I had these 3 different personas of those who were being interviewed on the podcast. It was a 2-part selection process where I picked the podcasts and the podcast hosts. You really couldn't separate the podcast from the podcast host because they all were, the hosts were synonymous with the podcast that they hosted. And then the individual episode selection, which was the selection of the individual interviewees. So the selected podcast hosts, as I mentioned before, had experience that ranged from a minimum of 40 episodes to a maximum of 660. So as you can imagine, their experience in having spoken with so many AI experts allowed them to provide a rich source of insights as well. So I wanted to target episodes that showcased individuals in organizations that ranged from 200 people to roughly 10,000 plus employees. They had to have performed in a leadership capacity and be either responsible for the decisions surrounding artificial intelligence, or they were being directly impacted by the use of those systems. I selected episodes that included experts in several different industries. They included agriculture, construction, financial services, a general category because there were some that had such rich experiences that weren't specific to an individual industry. Healthcare and life sciences, manufacturing, retail, and the software industry. I originally selected 172 podcasts that met, podcast episodes that met these criteria. And then I was able to, through a pre-listening exercise, so I listened to the podcast at 2x speed to get a general feel for what they were talking about and to make sure that they actually met the criteria for the study. That landed on 4 specific podcasts, 5 podcast hosts, because one podcast had 2 hosts, and 46 unique episodes that met the criteria. So out of those 172, I selected 46. And this is my episode reviewers. This is self-description. This is out of their self-description. They had to have a minimum of 5 years of experience, knowledge of their enterprise working environments, and familiarity with AI technology. I wanted very much to have a diversity of both ethnicity and gender identity as they self-reported. And then through these keywords, you notice that from their experience, the thing that they most had in common was that they had strong data background, and they most had machine learning background in common. Research questions were addressed through narrative descriptions of the podcast interviewees, hosts, and those quotes that were gathered from my research reviewers. They were broken into topical insights covering areas that were very broad, but just as an example here of data management and quality in AI initiatives, all the way to the ethical implications of AI. And they were very nuanced. These narratives are very nuanced. So what did I learn? From question 1, asking what motivated these people to pursue artificial intelligence, these were the 6 categories that emerged. Business value creation emerged over and over and over throughout this study. Foundational consideration of data and their infrastructure. Did they have the tools in place? Did they have the foundation in place to be successful with AI? Were they directly impacting a business challenge? That was critical. How were they driving stakeholder impact? This was one thing that they were really thinking about, is how did they impact their stakeholders? What they were thinking about impacting their organizational culture and resources, and the integration and utilization of AI in other business processes. For research question 2, 5 categories emerged. When we talked about, when I talk about what actions did these individuals take, they were putting AI into action. They were really, literally, let's see what happens when we try it. They were piloting AI. They were strategically implementing it against a business challenge. They were prioritizing a comprehensive technology approach to enable AI success. So it was very common for multiple technologies to be used in concert with artificial intelligence. And then they were looking for, or rather they deployed using effective tactics that were long established as effective tactics in the technology arena. And then they were focused on behaving ethically. I saw this over and over again, that leading ethically mattered to them. And then the third question, what outcomes did they create? There were a myriad of business benefits that were created, everything that ranged from financial benefits to customer improvement, customer satisfaction improvement, employee satisfaction improvement with many of the efforts that they undertook. They were able to create more innovative products and services. So the benefits ranged across a very broad range. They were able to create a human-centric and culture of innovation. This was fascinating to see as they brought these teams together to build out artificial intelligence projects. They were able to identify ways to use it in partnership, to use AI in partnership with humans in their workforces, in their customers, in their partners that they worked with. And this was all working hand in hand with this idea of being innovative and creating a culture that supported innovation. And then finally, the third category of positive impact was they were able to make strategic decisions and manage risk more effectively by leveraging artificial intelligence. So the framework that underpinned my study was the Model AI Governance Framework, and it did consist of 2 principles and 4 practices. And so what I learned through this was that there were 2 principles that were both adhered to, and 3 out of 4 of the practices of the Model AI Governance Framework and its companion document were adhered to. So from a principles perspective, human centricity was key, and 4 sub-themes emerged in human centricity from the data. Employee interactions and customer experience supporting AI, building trust and resilience through ethics and culture in AI, and aligning human creativity with executive business rigor. Saw that pop up over and over again. And then driving improved outcomes through a focus on people. So for anyone who's been hearing in the media that artificial intelligence is going to take over and all of these fears that are out there in the market, what I saw in the data over and over again is that when artificial intelligence is really powerful and when it is able to create positive outcomes is when it is in partnership with humanity. The second principle, decision-making. Decision-making popped up over and over again as well, and it fell into 3 sub-themes. Strategic decision-making for positive AI use. We saw that. Assessing the costs and benefits of AI projects, and prioritizing human satisfaction for long-term benefits. Those 3 were ways that decision-making was leveraged and created positive outcomes. Then with regard to the practices, I saw support for the framework in 3 internal governance structures and measures, the level of human involvement, and stakeholder interaction. All 3 of those were directly supported by the data. There was one element that really deviated with regard to the practices. So the 4th practice was operations management, and that quadrant specifically defined 2 criteria that included seeking to minimize bias and using a risk-based approach to measure explainability, robustness, and regular tuning. And what I found in the data is that a focus on bias was definitely there. I saw the focus on bias and avoiding bias over and over again, but there was nothing in the data that demonstrated a clarity of risk-based measurements. And then the largest deviation was this consistent overarching theme that focus on business value at every turn, at solving real business challenges, was a core underpinning. That is not represented in the Model AI Governance Framework. So from a thematic perspective, the 5 themes that emerged were the creation of business value, a focus on customer needs. Those who focused on customer needs were really driving positive outputs. Collaborative teams. So any organization that had silos and didn't work well cross-functionally with other organizations, they struggled, where those that were successful were collaborating across their entire organization and really bringing in diversity of perspective into their teams. And that often included external perspectives from those vendor practitioners and from those consultants. Culture shifting. Culture shifting was necessary for AI to be successful. And then in no surprise to anyone who works with AI, the criticality of the role of data, the cleanliness of your data, the availability of your data, and the recency of your data. So from a value perspective, the key underpinning here was to make sure that you were focused on solving business problems and that you avoided what participants referenced as toy AI. Just because something was a neat technology didn't mean that you wanted to pursue it. I love this particular quote: AI should not be seen as just a tool, but rather as a means to address specific challenges and to generate tangible business value. That was a fantastic quote. Focus on customer needs. Again, this was a critical element. a fantastic quote here. You don't want to treat any machine learning algorithm as a black box that doesn't help you to overcome what you're trying to achieve. You want very explainable, deliverable, return on investment generating and satisfying to the consumers that you serve. Having collaborative teams. Here's a great quote. Customers often take meetings with AI companies, even when they don't intend to undertake a project, to use these discussions as education, to learn. So these individuals were reaching outside of their own area even to collaborate and to learn. From a culture shifting perspective, AI governance empowers us to operate with agility and transparency and trust, enables you to define policies and establish accountability, to give people visibility to the guardrails for the use of artificial intelligence. And that shifting of culture to being able to embrace innovation, embrace creativity and partnership, to start with small projects, build trust from that, and then continue to build momentum over time. That culture shift was just critical. And then with regard to data, powerful quote here, industry variances can create challenges such as a lack of sensors and devices to collect real-time data on industrial equipment, which can inhibit AI adoption in laggard industries. So for these industries that are lagging with regard to data in any way, shape, or form, they're also experiencing a lagging challenge with regard to implementing and being successful with AI. So theme one, pursue business problems over and over and over again. That comes up. I want to show you an example of how many times these themes came up. So if you look to the very right of your screen, you'll see that this value creation concept was identified in 40 out of 46 of my episodes. So obviously it's very top of mind. Those collaborative skills, 29 episodes. Shifting culture, 22 episodes. The criticality of the role of data was pointed out in 17 episodes, and that focus on the need for customer centricity was in 11 episodes. The idea about focusing on the customer, what emerged from that was that this aided decision-making and prioritization, because there's so many things that they could do. That focus on customers allowed them to get really clear about where they would focus. Having these collaborative teams with modern skills, this theme emerged, and as I went back and looked at current literature, I found that that had popped up in several, literally 2023 pieces of literature were supporting that as well, and this power of collaboration between humans and AI. The culture shifting element, being able to ensure that your culture is aligned with the needs to drive AI to success. And that means that you have to be willing to have minor failures, because when we pursue artificial intelligence, we don't know exactly what it's going to teach us. We don't know what, for example, machine learning is going to learn. So we may not get exactly the results that we want. So we've got to build a culture that is resilient and knows that things could look differently than expected, and invest in that as a learning opportunity. Take what you've learned and pivot to the next project. So use these small iterative projects to continue to move forward. With regard to the criticality of the role of data, there were two main things that popped to the top. The foundational role of data governance. You had to have strong data governance and management so that your data is in good quality shape. And then the second piece of it is the actual importance of that data quality for the effectiveness of AI. In the old adage, garbage in, garbage out, and AI amplifies everything. So if your data is bad, AI will amplify the negativity. So what we learned from this is that the study highlights the relevance of the Model AI framework, its 2 guiding principles and its practices, and the adherence to both the principles and 3 out of 4 of the practices. There was a gap identified in this area of value creation because you saw in 40 out of 46 episodes, that was the primary theme, but that isn't included in the Model AI governance framework. And this is, understanding this is really going to be critical for organizations to be successful with AI as they move forward. This importance of this value creation, and I'm going to dig that down a little bit lower. So the value broke into motivations. What is the ongoing focus on value creation? So at every step in the process, these individuals were talking about if they started to get pulled away from that focus, they had someone who owned that responsibility and really recentered them to make sure that they didn't get lost in the technology and pulled away, but they stayed focused on the business value. And that was over and over throughout the process. They would talk about having to pull themselves back to that. And it consistently emphasized this as the primary requirement for AI success. I did talk a little bit earlier about my study limitations. I wanted to point out that 43 of my 46 episodes were actually from the same podcast. They were from the AI and Business podcast because there was such fantastic data there. There is potential bias because of that limited range of perspectives from the one host. I chose to use interviewee quotes heavily and the quotes from that individual in a very minor capacity because he was represented in an outsized fashion. There are limitations in understanding due to the audio format. There weren't any visual cues. And then the time-saving approach that I used in crafting the episode synopses for the research reviewers to review, then that could have biased their perception of what the individual said in the interviews. I could have missed something in the nuances. So from a research implications perspective, this contributes to AI governance and value creation research. And it also indicates that during this process, I felt like I validated the opportunity to use podcasts as a data source, and I created some new research instruments as I went through that process. Implications in practice, which is really where my heart lies because I am a long-term IT practitioner myself. There were implications around value, making sure that we are focusing on value, that we are combining technologies, don't try to use AI by itself, and that we use a small and iterative approach. There was human centricity. Don't try to replace humans with AI. This was all about AI plus humanity. From a technology perspective, making sure that you had that clear focus on creating value, that you're managing your data well, and that you are dealing with privacy issues. Privacy issues came up. And decision-making, we want to engage in clear and interactive decision-making. We want to evaluate both the risks and the benefits, and we want to look for creating impactful customer experiences. Recommendations for future research, I think we've got to bridge this gap between value and AI governance. We need to understand more about the impact of culture on AI projects. We need to investigate the customer digital technology adoption and loyalty elements. That was something that was just on the cusp and made me want to go further. We need to explore the synergy with other technologies that many of these individuals reference, the interactivity between multiple types of AI and multiple technologies with AI. So more research could be done there. Qualitative research on AI and gender. Unfortunately, it was extremely hard for me to find female representation as I went through the study, which unfortunately, based on my personal experience, wasn't a surprise, but I would really like to see us be more purposeful in that space. We need to understand the impact of the regulatory patchwork that is happening on a global scale and what that means directly for AI innovation and our ability to continue to innovate and to protect things like national security. And then the convergence of multiple frameworks in for-profit environments. I saw a convergence of frameworks that included the Model AI Governance Framework, the LEVA Business Diamond, Digital to the Core, and Trustworthy AI frameworks. There was a large convergence, but they weren't exactly the same. So digging in more about that overlap in those frameworks could provide really interesting insights. So I realize that we're at the end of our time, but if you want to ask questions, I am yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palmer. This was really interesting, and I appreciate your academic scientific process in conducting this research. I wanted to ask, well, first of all, we only have 5 minutes until our next presentation begins, and I have to create or open a new Zoom link. So very quickly, you mentioned one podcast. Can you recommend one podcast for our members that are going to teach AI in an educational setting? I recommend a podcast for them to start following to learn more.
The AI in Business podcast that is hosted by a gentleman named Daniel Faggella, Faggella. He does a fantastic job of getting a wide breadth and depth of individuals who are working with AI every day on his show. And he is the gentleman who had over 660 podcasts under his belt. So he is a seasoned host and gets great information out of his guests. So I would really encourage you to try that one.
Okay, thank you. So next 2 more minutes. Does anyone have a question?
Well, I have a comment and then a question. One is that I'm really glad to hear it stated that data becomes even more important instead of those gut feeling decisions that sometimes managers use. So the data governance, management, and data quality becomes even more important. And so that means that we can't scrimp on the data analysts in our business practices. And the question was, someone had asked in the chat, is it possible that we could, in addition to recording this, that we could also have access to the slides, because there's so much to assimilate, and this is really rich information.
I will absolutely share the slides with you. And there are actually 78 slides in this deck, and so many of them are hidden. So there's much more detail in the slide deck, and I'll be happy to share the whole thing with you.
Thank you. I just added that podcast to the chat. And also, Elizabeth, we are recording this, so we will share this link with you as well, with all of our members. So, okay, any other questions? 1 more minute.
I don't see the podcast yet in the chat.
It's a link.
Okay.
Do you see it now?
No, not yet.
Oh, I think okay, sorry.
You just sent it to me, right?
I sent it to everybody.
Okay.
Just now.
There it is. Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. This is the first time I've gotten to publicly talk about my research, and it was really fun to share it with people that care about this. So thank you so much for being an engaged audience.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to end this session now and invite everyone to switch over to the rest of our presentations from our members. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer.
My pleasure.
Hours.